Zooming, unmute, remote working, teleworking, workation, and Blur's Day. These new words have crept into our new normal reality since March 2020. The global pandemic has changed this world forever, and it will never be the same. So let's see where we are and where we are headed. Hello everyone, my name is Tatiana Strelchenko. I'm America House QU Director, and tonight I have a very special guest with us here at America House Studio. We are having hybrid program, another buzzword, so please meet Michael Bociurkiw, the author of the book Digital Pandemic. Hi Michael.
Thank you, good to be back at America House.
So great to have you here. If you do not mind, I will introduce you to our audience with a few facts about you.
Thank you.
So, Michael Bociurkiw is a global affairs analyst and two-time TEDx speaker. He is also the author of Digital Pandemic COVID-19, How Tech Went from Bad to Good. His geopolitical commentary is regularly featured on CNN Opinion. Having worked on the front lines of humanitarian emergencies, he's become a familiar voice on BBC World Television, CNN, CNN International, and Bloomberg Television. And tonight you're here at America House. I have so many questions about your book, and if you don't mind, I'll start with the very first one. I will not ask you why you wrote this book. I think it's pretty obvious that writers and journalists just couldn't stay away from such an important topic. But I do have a question how you wrote your book. So maybe you can tell us how you collected material and found data. And when was this aha moment when you decided, I'm writing the book about digital pandemic?
Well, thanks again, Tatiana, for the invitation. Good to be back at America House. And I have a strong affection for America. After all, I live right below the 49th parallel, the Canada-US border. So I consider my neighborhood part of the US Pacific Northwest as well. So very strong affiliation. But when I was started to think about this project, what I call live reporting project, I was actually in Portugal. I was there on a writing sabbatical, working on another book. And the title of that book was Digital Crack. And it's something I had been doing research almost 2 years. It was about smartphone and social media addiction. That had taken me really around the world to study how people are using technology, but also I went into the guts of big tech. What is it that tech does to really get us addicted to technology? And I found some incredible stuff, but not to dwell too much on that. Maybe that'll become a book someday. But I was able to benefit from that research, take some of it and put it into Digital Pandemic. And so I was quite far into the project in Portugal, and then we're already into spring of last year, and the pandemic, rumors of a pandemic of a virus started to circulate in China, and I took a rare break. I was actually on a superhighway in Spain driving when my friend Chris Dobson, my former colleague from the China Morning Post in Hong Kong, started texting me and saying, you better start paying attention to what's going on in China. This could be a very big thing. And we had both lived through the SARS pandemic in Southeast Asia, and we knew at that time that not only do viruses travel quickly, they don't respect borders, but in that particular case, the Chinese government lied about the pandemic, about the virus. They tried to cover it up. And, you know, it was amazing to me to think that, my goodness, could this be happening to us once again, but on a far, far bigger scale? Because the big difference this time, of course, is we're much, much more interconnected. Viruses can jump very, very quickly. So coincidentally at that time, friends had also been encouraging me to start a podcast. And it became Global Impact. And of course, because it's a podcast that connects the dots to make sense of the world, the pandemic was actually a big, big topic of that. So I was very lucky in the sense that I was able to tap my wide network of experts, public health experts, doctors, diplomats, you name it. Very many American diplomats. For example, I had Ambassador Vershbal, former U.S. ambassador to Korea and to Moscow, on stuff like people like that who could give a lot of insight. I also got accredited very on to the twice weekly World Health Organization press conferences, where we were able to really press officials there, and they were working under very, very difficult conditions for answers about what's happening. And so I kind of put on, sorry, and there was one more thing. I'm also, as you mentioned, a contributor to CNN Opinion, and they had tasked me early on in the pandemic to start writing about what's going on in China. So for example, that whistleblower doctor who first brought out word about the pandemic in China, and then got persecuted by the Chinese government very badly, and then he actually contracted COVID and died. The book eventually became dedicated to people like him as well. So those opinion pieces, the commentary I've created there, also kind of went into the book. So the writing was mostly the bulk of the project. The research was kind of all there in front of me, and we put it all together.
And what happened to the first book? It was just transformed into Digital Pandemic.
Bits and pieces. For example, as part of the research for Digital Crack, I went, for example, to California. I interviewed a guy called Ramsey Brown. He used to be a developer of apps, these addictive apps. And then he had an aha moment, and he said, well, actually, I'm going to develop an app to help people get unaddicted to social media, to their phones. So I talked to him. That's in the book. I went to a tech addiction center in Seattle, where parents send their kids, at not a very cheap price, by the way, to get kind of rehabilitated from tech addiction. These are mostly teens who are addicted to gaming. They spend the entire 24 hours, waking hours, in their bedrooms playing games. Nothing the parents could do, so they take them there. And then one last thing, I went to, for example, a lovely school in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And this is a school where smartphones are basically banned. The kids have to hand them in the morning. And I remember talking to the kids there, and they're the most calm, kind of considerate kids you'll ever meet. Whereas, for example, at the Tech Addiction Center in Seattle, it was sad because a lot of these, they were mostly boys. They could hardly string a sentence together. They couldn't hardly look you in the eye. Yeah, they were in really, really tough shape. So that helped inform a lot of what's in the book as well.
And now tech saved our lives.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to admit, when I was writing Digital Crack, my premise was that tech is mostly bad. I mean, look what it's doing. Let me give you an anecdote. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine up until the pandemic. I spent time in Singapore and elsewhere. And I think I mentioned in the book is that I go to playgrounds here in Kyiv or in Singapore, and there are no children playing. Why? Because the parents told me why. They're up in their apartments, air-conditioned apartments, on their screens. And it was very, very difficult to wean them off of them. So a lot of parents would ask me advice, like, what should we do to get our kids away from these screens? And you'll find a little bit of that advice in the book as well.
Have online school, and kids will want to go outside and play together.
This is, at the end of the book, I have a few predictions, and I hope I'm right about this, is that kids, having spent so much time looking at screens, distance learning, contacting their friends during lockdown, connecting with loved ones, perhaps will get a little bit tired of the screens and spend more time outside. One of the experts I talked to for this book, Diana Graber, she does a program called Cyber Civics, and she said that the numbers are just through the roof right now of how much time kids are spending on the screens. And parents, grandparents, we're all spending a lot more time on screens, which, by the way, I'm so happy we're doing this in a hybrid format.
Exactly.
Good to have a real person.
So true. In your book, you say that global pandemic is probably the first truly global event we all watched, observed on the tiny screens of our smartphones. For you, as a writer, as a journalist, how was it to participate or to witness this historic events?
Great question. I mean, I have to admit, one of the motivating factors I went to do Digital Crack is I think I too was addicted, because there are kind of two types of addictions, and I hope I'm not contradicting the experts, but because I talk to so many, but one is the actual screen itself and scrolling, checking Facebook, Twitter. The other is a kind of research or information searching addiction where us as journalists, we crave news, whereas a lot of people might first thing in the morning go on Instagram or Facebook, we normally go on Twitter to do our stuff. But I will say this, and this is kind of getting into the good face of tech, is for a lot of journalists, for a lot of people like myself who not only write, but we communicate with the outside world, speaking, consulting, tech was a lifesaver. We couldn't have done, this book would have been very, very difficult to do without technology. And I've got to say, what was really interesting is as word of the book got out, people started contacting me who apparently were following me on social media, and they said, hey, I'm a great editor in New Zealand, and I'd love to partner with you and edit this book. So the editor of the book, Nathan Smith, is from New Zealand. Then, of course, we needed someone to do this beautiful cover, and he had a friend, Antonina, who did this cover, and that was all done remotely. The interior kind of design of the book was done by someone in Victoria, British Columbia, close to where I live. Never met him, but we communicated over technology. And then my intern and editorial assistant, Pretty, she's in London, also found me on social media and said, can we collaborate? So again, without that, that would have been very, very difficult.
It's exciting to hear how many people, supported your
It was
work.
really a team effort. And, there's a saying, and I think I put it in the book, that writing a book is one of the loneliest things you can do in your life. And they aren't kidding, whoever said that. And it was tough, I have to tell you. In the middle of the pandemic, you're there on your own. There's no one to push you. You have to find that inner strength to get up and write. And I have to tell you, when I went from Portugal back to Canada, this was March already, because Prime Minister Trudeau said, all Canadians who can come home because we don't know where this pandemic is going to go. Shortly after that, we got a very, very strict lockdown, like many other places in the world, but we also got smoke from wildfires in Washington State and Oregon. And you look outside, you can't go anywhere, and you think, oh my gosh, has the apocalypse struck? So, but I plugged on, and the other thing I have to say is a lot of friends stepped up forward and said, can I proofread for you? Can I fact check? Too many names to mention here, or almost in the book, but so grateful. Yeah.
Amazing. What were the most surprising things you learned while writing your book?
Another great question. Well, one is, of course, I learned a lot about self-publishing and doing this. It's not an easy thing for the first timer, but luckily for me, I got a lot of advice from experts or from people who have done it before. But there were a lot of, maybe for me it wasn't that surprising, but one of the key things, the key messages in the book is that, who really love the pandemic? Most of us don't like pandemics, but there are people who do. Dictators, autocrats, strongmen. I can mention a country right next to Ukraine where the strongman has been beating up protesters and journalists. But a lot of strongmen have used the pandemic to level the playing field in their favor. And what I mean by that is by introducing really strong draconian laws to lock away opponents, to restrict journalists. And of course, the president here, Zelensky, is democratically elected. But I talked to journalists here, and there were things happening kind of under the radar that we'll see whether they're lifted. And I'll give you an example. For example, a lot of court hearings here were closed to the public as soon as the pandemic hit, in the interests of public health. But then they forgot to live stream them or give some kind of digital access to journalists covering it. Journalists here and elsewhere told me, for example, that they found it very difficult to interview people over the phone or over social media. A lot of sources you have to meet online. Another surprise, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by how some Western elected leaders handled the pandemic. And what I mean by that, there was a lot of flip-flopping. On the one hand, they say we're going to follow science to put in place the best, policies to protect you, the voting public. But then I think the political reality would hit them. Maybe they have an election coming up, and then they would back away or do a U-turn. The other thing I saw is there's a subchapter in the book called Rules for Thee, but Not for Me. So you would see a lot of elected leaders, we don't need to name countries, people can guess who they are, who would say, okay, no travel, stay home, it's not safe to travel, even though it's Christmas. And what happens? Mostly thanks to social media, photos or videos would be snapped of them traveling to some warm destination in the middle of a Canadian winter. And people would say, well, wait a minute, I thought he just told me to stay home, and then he's with his family down on a beach somewhere. So I think that was a wake-up call to a lot of people. One more point, because I really don't want to forget this one, is we know the inequalities in politics. A lot of our leaders or leadership are males. And with all due respect to my male friends, I don't think they perform very well. I think in many cases, ego got the better of them. And I think female leaders really shone through this pandemic. If we take, the leader of New Zealand or the Premier of New South Wales, who's really under a lot of pressure right now because they have a strict lockdown there, the President of Taiwan, really did fantastic things to keep their people safe and to keep numbers low, to crush the curve. And, I remember in UNICEF, when I was with UNICEF, we had done studies that showed that when it comes to women and their leadership capabilities, they tend to make a lot more family-friendly, community-friendly decisions. And that really showed itself in this pandemic.
Absolutely. And you just listed a few countries that responded really well to the pandemic. Maybe is there a champion country, the one that was like the best?
Well, I guess I have to defend Singapore because I wrote an entire chapter how Singapore slinged COVID. And look, everywhere mistakes were made. The thing we now know, even more so than ever about viruses, is that they exploit our weaknesses. They get into cracks. When we're looking the other way, that's when they attack. And that's, for example, what's happening right now in Taiwan, to a certain extent in Singapore, in Hong Kong, Australia, where COVID has apparently traveled through some of the hotels where people are under a strict quarantine. So, that's something that we'll come out of this pandemic, I think, I'm hoping, with a build back better approach that, God forbid we have another one on this scale, that we'll know better how to handle these things. But again, I think what we're going to see too is that when people go to the ballot boxes, henceforth, they're going to be a lot careful who they vote for. Because again, if they betrayed us in the elected leaders, if they betrayed us in the sense that they're telling us they're trying to protect us and everything, and they don't, well, that's, to me, hypocrisy. One more quick thing I would say to look out for, in Canada, in my whole province of British Columbia, a lot of emergency laws have been put into place. Let's keep an eye as voters, as responsible citizens, on how long those emergency regulations, those powers stay on the books, because I think as numbers start to decline, that's when we should be asking questions on when these powers will be lifted.
Absolutely. I just want to remind our audience that they can also leave their questions on our Facebook page or YouTube channel, and I will make sure Michael knows about those questions and can answer your questions. The title of your book is so thought-provoking, Digital Pandemic, and it made me think about just this crazy idea. What if we have computer virus that hits all computers globally and have another pandemic? What do you think about cybersecurity these days?
I was 3 weeks ago on Al Jazeera commenting about that because I think it's JBS, the major meat producer in the United States, had a cyber attack, and they were threatened with, they were told to pay a ransom. This is happening more and more and more, and of course it was a big topic at the recently concluded Biden-Putin summit in Geneva. And I compliment the president for drawing a red line to the Russian president, saying that any more of these major cyber attacks, well, we have ways to counteract that. If you were to ask me whether that was taken seriously by the Russian side, I don't think so. Putin is a dictator. Dictators normally ask not why, but why not. And a lot of these attacks, colleagues of mine in the investigative journalism field have traced them squarely and fairly back to Russia. I think the kind of conflicts, the battles, the wars of the future, you won't have one shot fired, one missile fired. Tanks aren't going to move. It's all going to be done by cyber. And look, I remember working here in Ukraine, and we saw how vulnerable, when there was an attack here a few years ago, how the ministries were. So the kind of approach of a lot of strongmen and autocrats is to, like a virus, exploit weaknesses, to poke and see where the weakest point is. And sadly, in a lot of Western democracies, that's where we have our problem. We don't have these strong cyber defenses. Why? Because we're open societies, and we didn't expect people to attack us in that way. It's a very, very worrisome trend.
Totally agree. In your book, you draw a comparison between China's response to COVID-19 and Chernobyl. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this ideology.
I don't think that was very well received in Beijing, which is why I don't go to China. I've written strongly about what's going on in Hong Kong, and sadly, I cannot go there anymore safely. By the way, we still have 2 Michaels being incarcerated in China. I don't want to become the 3rd Michael. Okay. So when Chernobyl struck, and by the way, people may notice that we use the Ukrainian spelling of Chernobyl in the book, not the other one, in case they were wondering. But I was working at the Ukrainian Weekly in Jersey City as a staffer, and of course, I was a young reporter at that time. We didn't have internet then. We had very little communication resources except the telephone. And I remember very, very clearly reporting on that and how Soviet officials tried to cover it up from the get-go, how they lied to the world, how people really, really suffered. The death toll, we don't even know the exact number, but how that spread. And it was only foreign countries that alerted us because the radiation cloud went beyond Ukraine and Belarus's borders. So the way the Chinese leadership responded, again from the get-go with COVID-19, was very, very similar, I thought. Again, the way they went after the whistleblower doctors. In the book trailer, where I think we're going to post it on the YouTube page or whatever, you'll see at the beginning there's a citizen journalist talking about how he was in Wuhan in the early days reporting on the beginnings of the pandemic. There were 3 or 4, at least, others in Wuhan at that time who also had reported. The book is dedicated as well to these people because they really wanted to expose the truth. But what happened? They were cut off. Social media accounts closed down, arrested. Some of them disappeared for months and months at a time. And, the other thing that really struck me was the way the Chinese government so arrogantly handled the World Health Organization. Now, let me be clear, I have great respect for the experts, the officials at the WHO. They've had a very, very tough time. The problem with a lot of these UN agencies is who kind of owns them or who supports them is member states. And China is a big donor to the WHO. It's a very influential country. So there's a limit to what the WHO can say what's going on in China. But they did try to send very early on an investigative team. And by then, they were either had trouble getting access or stuff was already closed or covered up. That market where, it's alleged that the virus came from was already all cleaned up and locked up. So very, very similar tactics used. And, I'm often asked, if I can, just for a minute or two, about the difference between China and Russia and how they react to crises or to emergencies. I think the big difference with China is they take the long game. There's a saying, in the West, you have the watches. In China, we have the time. So, rather than going out and, poisoning someone on the streets of London with an umbrella tip or something like that, or in an airplane over Russia, they will do things in a much more subtle way. And this is what we have to be careful with. And I know Secretary Blinken and President Biden and others, a lot of people under even the Obama administration have warned about this. for example, their ability with cyber, but also you're seeing now, for example, a lot more influence of China in Hollywood, influencing the narrative, coming out in movies and stuff like that. In Canada, we have organizations which look like they're kind of voluntary charity organizations, but who's backing them, who formed them? Chinese government, the Chinese embassy. The other thing I'm seeing right now is a lot more aggressive behavior by Chinese diplomats, whether it's the ambassador in Ottawa, London, United States. We call it wolf warrior diplomacy. Writing opinion pieces in our newspapers, things like that. It's a very different approach.
So you cannot enter China these days?
I can't enter China, Hong Kong, and I have to tell you, because we're kind of in the neighborhood, after what happened to Roman as he flew over Belarus from Athens to Vilnius on that Ryanair, Tatiana, that continues to send a chill down my back, because it could be any one of us. I was on BBC World just after that happened, and I said, I could be on a Thai Airways jet flying across the South China Sea between Taiwan and mainland China. If I was wanted by the Chinese authorities, maybe they want a third Michael, who knows, that airplane could easily be brought down. That set such a bad precedent, and that's why I said the West has to take the strongest possible measures against this, thuggery, air piracy. It could happen again, and I'm afraid it might. And I'm not saying that people like me are going to stop traveling, but I think it's something in the back of our minds when we travel or when we write, and I hope it doesn't scare people from telling the truth.
Thank you. Of course, this is scary.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Returning to Ukraine during the pandemic, and maybe you traveled around the world a lot, and of course you frequently return to Ukraine. Maybe you can tell us where we are as a country in terms of technology, what trends are common here and in Europe and everywhere, sure, and where we are behind.
Well, I got to say, Tanya, if there's ever a country where you can come and see people embracing technology, it is here. I mean, the country is so far advanced in terms of, for example, contactless payment systems. People don't carry cash. And by the way, one of the predictions in the book is that we'll see the elimination of cash. It's already well underway in China. But especially young people here, they seem to be on their screens 24/7. It's almost as if the smartphone is an attachment of their hand. They walk with it. I wouldn't recommend that, but the way people communicate, the gig economy here has really taken off. I saw, the number of delivery services on the streets here, things like that. And that's very, very good. And also, technology is really booming here in Western Ukraine, for example. As you well know, there are a lot of tech startups here. And even, for example, our iconic Canadian Tire hardware store in Canada outsources a lot of its coding and stuff like that to Ukraine. So Ukraine is on the top of the wave there. I understand a lot of young tech experts from Belarus have fled here to Ukraine. Thank God they've been welcome, and they can find jobs here. Having said that, the inequality gaps here are huge. I know capital cities are not a very good reflection of what's happening in the rest of the country, but I got to say the wealth gap here seems to be getting even bigger. I wish that technology would get more into the public health system, into the hospitals, where you can go to some hospitals in outlying areas and you think you're in the Soviet times. A big area where I don't think the government or the administration is using technology is in what we call public health messaging. I've been here for a while, and I can't say I've seen very much in terms of, reminders, get vaccinated, wear masks, keep your social distancing. The use of influencers, the use of opinion leaders here to get people to start thinking about vaccination. If you want, we can get into what I forecast later for Ukraine, but there's good side and bad side to technology here. But I'm very impressed with how people have just embraced technology. It's part of their daily life here.
I agree. I also am amazed sometimes how people are, tech forward here.
Yeah.
And especially young people.
Oh, and sorry, Tanya, I should say that I was at the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament here, and I saw how digitalized everything is getting here. I'm a board member of the East Europe Foundation, and they're doing a lot to support the president's kind of initiatives to digitalize everything. I think President Zelensky has said we have to become a smartphone nation. You can apply for things online. You don't have to wait days and days, in queues anymore. So that has changed very, very
And more
rapidly.
transparency.
Exactly. Yeah, the digital asset declaration thing is very, very good. But I think it has to be backed by more enforcement too.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think in our contemporary world, it's almost a bad taste not to have your favorite conspiracy theory. Which one is yours? Do you have one about the global pandemic?
Well, I don't subscribe to what the Chinese and the Russians have said, that's for sure. It's in the book. The Chinese, for the foreign ministry, has said it maybe came from U.S. servicemen. It's ridiculous. Now, there's, of course, a little bit of a debate going on out there on whether it actually leaked from a lab or whether it was leaked intentionally from a lab in China or whether it did come from the animal to human transmission through a marketplace. I'm more on the side of that theory. I've been to China many, many times, and I've been to those markets, and I see how congested things are, how different animals are mixed together. And I've been in enough WHO press conferences to listen to the experts there and say, that's one theory they're really seriously looking at because it can happen now. But it's not only when it comes to the origins of the virus, it's when it comes to vaccines as well. And that is the sad thing about what's happening here especially, but in other countries too. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. I've heard everything that people have asked me here, if I get the vaccination, are they putting a chip into me? Am I going to be more easily monitored? I'm not going to make fun of these people, and I'm not going to criticize them because people just don't know. And that is where government has to play a much, much bigger role, is to correct these misconceptions. But, you talked about cyber warfare. That's part of the Russian arsenal as well. Huge, huge to discredit. Going back to the time when I worked for UNICEF here in Ukraine on the measles outbreak here, is that you have a lot of Russian disinformation. They're everywhere. They're on the chat, pages and Facebook and everywhere sending stuff. So my advice there is to double check, go to reliable sources, and I'll just repeat what a lot of other people have said. Don't forward information that you're not sure about. Trust me, I have lots of educated contacts in the United States, and the stuff I've heard from them as well. They said, we're not getting vaccinated because this is what could happen to you. And,
my favorite, the funniest one I've heard is that the virus was created by dogs who wanted their masters to stay at home with them.
I have not heard that one.
I love it.
Funny about that, because dog ownership really went up during the pandemic. And dogs have got COVID too, by the way.
Exactly.
First one was in Hong Kong.
And I think there is this recent article saying that workers prefer to stay at home because of their pets these days. They choose pets over work because, they don't want to leave their pets at home by themselves anymore. What do you think about employment trends? What employers should think about?
Very interesting, very interesting. I'll give you an anecdote. I was in California. It was my first stop on this long, long trip, and we were thinking of actually going to Silicon Valley to do maybe an event there with the tech community. But you know what? Now is not the time to do that. Why? Because everyone's working from home. But it's very interesting because that is, of course, the good side of tech. It allowed us to continue our work, aside from connecting with loved ones and so on. We were almost, and I know we're going to have Abigail Posner from Google on in a minute talking about this, but I'll let her say it better than I, but it allowed us to really not skip a beat and continue being productive from home. It allowed a lot of people to actually leave their boring jobs, boring according to them, and go enter the gig economy, start up a new business with very, very, very little difficulty. But I think I was asked this in Bloomberg way back in March when I was in New York City by David West, and he says, what do you think is going to happen? And I said, well, there's going to be a huge adoption spurt of working from home technology, Zoom and stuff like that. But what remains to be seen is how much the employers will tolerate that. There have been some big firms, including from Silicon Valley, who originally said, yeah, you can work home from forever. But now they're saying, actually, September is going to be time. Look, there's even a career consideration. Like if you're going to stay home and work, and then some of your colleagues, gung-ho, energetic colleagues, are in the office in meetings in person. I mean, what could that say about you? Could it retard your career climb, stuff like that? I think a lot of bosses are not comfortable with most of their team working from home, but they have to get over it. And let's see whether they're going to keep up with technology to do that.
Totally. I think you mentioned Abigail from Google. I think we have a surprise prepared for our audience.
We do. So, well, I blabbered a bit on social media, but so Abigail Posner is one of my favorite experts when it comes to technology. We became friends quite some time ago, and when I was switching from Digital Crack to this particular book, Digital Pandemic, she's one of the first people I went to interview. We had a discussion very early on in the pandemic on where things will go. Abigail is director of creative for Google, and she's also a future gazer. And she couldn't be online with us right now live because I think she has a film taping as we speak in New York City. But just a couple of days ago, we were able to get her on video, and I started by asking her out the following questions. So here we go with Abigail.
Thank you.
So Abigail, in my book, I have a feeling you won't argue with the subtitle. So it says how COVID-19, how tech went from bad to good.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, like during the pandemic? I know you and I spoke very early on in the pandemic about what's going to happen, but looking back now over the past year and a half, what kind of positive roles did you see tech play especially?
Yeah, I mean, so many. And in fact, I just was reviewing the YouTube trends report that just came out and reinforced the same story that you're sharing and I experienced, and which is that people really leaned into digital, particularly digital video, like never before, in so many ways, and in ways I think that I didn't predict. So I'm very used to video conferencing. That's part of my life. But for many, it became the way to connect with people. And so that I expected to happen, and it did happen. And people really recognized the value of, even if they can't connect in person, they can still connect in so many ways. And you have sight, sound, and motion that just gives so much more to that human experience. But they also leaned into digital to help give a sense of what's going on in the world, right? Everything from understanding what's happening on a daily basis around COVID and looking at the data, which is what I did religiously, to understanding how can they gather with others and protest what we're seeing as inequities in our society. And so the digital space became a way to connect with people. It became a way certainly to entertain us, right? I mean, no question, streaming brands just went, crazy in terms of their impact with people, because we needed entertainment, we needed to escape, we needed to just feel good, right? But also the digital space, and again, I turned to video in particular, became our source of information, and really important information, game-changing, world-changing information that we needed in order to reconcile ourselves in what was going on in the world. So, as I said, I did think that people would be leveraging the digital space to connect more, because it's always been a connection point. But the fact that it was a place for people to also really learn, and not just learn like DIY learning, I mean, really learn about our world and be able to figure out how they wanted to interact with the world as a result, was interesting to me. And I think too, what you see is just great ingenuity that was expressed in the digital space. Whether it was like me saying, okay, look, everybody's now doing these Zoom things, let me just create a TV show, to people of all ages, shapes, and sizes, just saying, I've got something to share, even if it's crazy or important, like how to tie a tie, and I'm going to be on there to help people.
And you didn't seem to skip a beat much when the pandemic started, because you were pretty much wired up and used to this, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I still had to get my gear on, right? I remember connecting with you to get a new mic and get lights and configure the space so that I could accommodate all the digital assets that I was bringing into my home office, because I never had it before.
Okay, now, so welcome to Ukraine virtually. And I'm going to tell you, Abigail, the use of smartphones here, of all this technology, is absolutely huge here. And I remember when you and I spoke many months ago, and it's in the book actually, you gave me a really, really cool explanation on why people love to post so many things.
Yeah.
And I think you used the raising the barn kind of analogy. Can you go over that with me? Just talk us through that one, because it's really great for people here, I think, to understand why people post so much.
Sure. A number of years ago, I was intrigued with what this whole social media thing was. I mean, it seemed vapid, if anything, negative. And so I believe in human beings, and I believe that people don't do things for no reason. So I wanted to dig in and try to understand what was the world of social media all about. Why were people intrigued by it? Why did you have to be on one social media site versus another social? Just be on Facebook, be done with it, right? So in line with a number of studies that I was conducting, I decided to hire anthropologists to dig into what is it about our deep human relationship to, in this case, social media. And we found many fascinating insights around the differences among them, what people do with them, how even the slightest thumbs up, heart response is quite edifying, and it's quite affirming. And as we dug deeper, and we learned about the culture of these spaces, and they all have different subcultures. It's like a cosmopolitan world of social media sites, but there is kind of a unifying culture and sort of a unifying language, one that is way more human than I think, a typical memo, or how people would respond in email and so forth, or perhaps even on the telephone. There is a kind of a human, sometimes not so nice, which also is part of that humanity. There's a realness and rawness to the space. And people were using it for so many different things. Some of it's seemingly frivolous, like, you like my new hairstyle, to, what do you think about my new book? To, I'm thinking of going to travel to Uruguay. Where should I go? Hive mind, help me out. And so all of these different types of conversations, what we saw in a nutshell, if you kind of look at the totality of the conversations and the truly kind of human and real responsiveness that was happening, sense of response, that really what was going on is that people were looking to social media as a way to test out, share, learn about themselves. Self-make through others is basically what's going on. And whether that's self-making, I like my hair, you like my hair color? Okay, more people like my hair color than not. I think I'm going to keep with this hair color. To that book idea really is strong. To people are buying from my business, I'm going to keep selling these earrings. To should I leave my husband because he's beating me? Right? So that all those conversations were really helping people grow, because there was this expectation of exchange of feelings, affirmations, insights, and ideas. And all of that exchange allowed people to grow and build and self-make. And so the barn raising symbol was ironically old-fashioned, but in a way so reflective of what's going on, that we're raising this barn together. That while people, before social media may have had a group of friends that they tapped, but mostly were kind of in that Emersonian, Thoreauian, if you will, mindset of like, I'm going to achieve this on my own. What social media is allowing us to do is achieve together. And you cannot raise a barn on your own. You need to have the community raise it with you. And that's what social media is enabling.
I love that explanation. And finally, I think we have to get you over here at some point because you could do some very interesting observing here. I got to tell you, Abigail, like people don't exchange business cards anymore here. You know what they do?
Right.
Let's friend each other on Facebook or on Instagram.
Right.
A lot of folks here don't even watch TV anymore. They're watching YouTube.
Right.
All the channels here are live streaming. So
Right.
it'd be really interesting for you to come here and observe that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really the case all over the world. I don't even, I think I had to throw away I finally threw away all my business cards. And yes, you know, I have 3 children, ranging in age from 15 to 20, and they don't watch TV either. They get, and they learn and grow through YouTube too. Sometimes they learn to just sit back and relax with YouTube, but they also come back with some really interesting information about the world.
This is fascinating. We definitely want to bring Abigail to Ukraine.
Yeah,
for
isn't she a rock star?
She is. What a great interview. I think we have a question from someone and who commented on our Facebook page. So if you don't mind.
Sure.
So this question is from Terence Molozinski. Thank you, by the way, Terence. What role should Canada play in the ongoing development of Ukraine in the near future?
Well, thank you for that question. I believe it's from Manitoba. Canada has historically been very, very much involved in Ukraine, with Ukraine. I believe we were the first Western nation to recognize Ukraine's independence. And, you know, I'm not going to gloss over everything because it has been to a certain extent a rocky road, of course, depending on what administration is there. But I think we should, as any country, always review our assistance, our support to Ukraine or to any other country that we support, because things change very quickly. I think that a big role Canada, well, I know actually a big role Canada has played here is, for example, in capacity development, also in the development of the patrol police here. Lots and lots of pressure on various points on eliminating corruption. I know that eliminating corruption is something that President Biden brought up recently, that has to happen perhaps at a quicker pace. And I think any Ukrainian president will be criticized for any slight backsliding on corruption. It isn't an easy thing. I mean, corruption, I've lived in many countries around the world. It exists on very, very many different levels, and it ain't going to go away overnight. That's what people have to understand. At the moment, the biggest, I think, role Canada can play is with its G7 and G20 partners. And one of those is not to allow the G7 to become the G8 again, not to allow President Putin to be rewarded for his territorial grabs, for his cyber attacks, for killing of journalists and opponents and things like that. It is a big, big worry of mine at the moment that Germany and France seem to be kind of probing and seeing whether there's a role to bring Russia back into these kind of Western alliances. No, it isn't time. And in fact, I would say we have to go the other way, is that I think the Russian leadership needs to know that there are consequences for doing what they're doing. Whether it's assisting Lukashenko in Belarus, whether it's these terrible cyber attacks, whether it's rattling their saber in the Black Sea, or over Crimea or over eastern Ukraine. And so there have to be painful consequences, even if that means removing Russia even temporarily from the international financial system. That is the pain they will really feel. But it takes a lot of backbone. If there's one thing we've learned during the pandemic from politicians is that not all of them have come into politics with strong backbones. And then, there's a lot of lobbying going on. A lot of them are afraid of what might be the retaliation if we do this. But right now, at this point of time, if Canada could play that big role in terms of standing strong with other Western democracies, the G7 and G20 group, and really insisting that there are red lines that cannot be crossed. And one more quick thing, Why is that so important globally is because if you allow one country to act like a thug, other countries could follow suit very quickly.
Thank you. And thank you, Terence. I would love to remind our visitors that you could leave your questions on Facebook, America House Facebook page, or on YouTube, and I will make sure to pass them over to Michael. We already started discussing the topic of misinformation during COVID-19. And will you say it was unprecedented, and what we just, normal humans, individuals can do to prevent those fakes and manipulation?
Well, look, misinformation, disinformation was there a long time before COVID. As technology develops, it's a lot easier to deploy as a weapon against Western open democracies. And in fact, I was on a Zoom conference discussion the other day sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and by the Permanent Mission of Ukraine to New York, to the United Nations. And one of the topics there, of course, was about disinformation and misinformation. And there was someone from Facebook who said, well, we've taken off so many millions of posts. We've labeled so many tens of millions of posts as fake or untrustworthy. But you know what? There's a lot more posted and existing on there than taken off. If you just look at the amount of disinformation on vaccines and things like that, it's huge. And, with all due respect to big tech, to Silicon Valley, you can't just leave this up to artificial intelligence machines to do. You need human beings. You need human beings around the world. You need human beings who understand the local language, who understand the context to catch this stuff. It's just mind-boggling. It's like a snowstorm, a blizzard of disinformation. But having said that too, is that people also have to educate themselves. And you asked about earlier the role of Canada. Taras's question is Canada could also do a lot to fund these NGOs or these expert bodies around the world who catch that disinformation and take it off, because that's a big part of the effort as well. I'm really, really worried about it. And look, we all spent a lot of time under lockdowns by ourselves in this pandemic. I could go on and on about what might be expected in terms of the mental health consequences, but a lot of people, I think, felt vulnerable. They felt weakened. They didn't know who to talk to. They didn't know where to get advice. And sad to say, these are the perfect conditions for these disinformation kind of entities to do their attacks. That's exactly when they strike.
And actually, my next question was about mental health. I have friends, and I observe that many of them are experiencing this new existential crisis. I think, is it post-COVID or COVID crisis? And one friend of mine told me that he lost the ability of feeling surprised anymore. It's like you cannot be shocked by things anymore because everything already happened. What do you think about mental health situation globally? Yeah,
it's something that is talked about in the book. One of the experts I interviewed was Dr. Sue Varma. We've become friends, actually. She's a really well-regarded mental health expert in the United States. She's on all of the network morning TV shows. So we've talked a lot about this. And, I put that question just a few weeks ago to the leadership of the World Health Organization in one of the biweekly press conferences. And I was really shocked by what Dr. Tedros, the Director General of WHO, said. He said that he expects the mental health tsunami, I think he used the word, to be worse than after the Second World War.
Wow.
Yeah. And I believe that because, whether it's here in Ukraine or even in, more developed countries, societies, is that there was almost pre-COVID a stigma to saying, I'm having trouble, I'm, not going to cope well. And very little resources were put to that. But I'm slowly seeing not only recognition that it's okay to kind of declare that you're having some kind of mental health problem, but to go seek help. And I know that, for example, in British Columbia, my home province, just a few hours ago, there was a new announcement that more resources will be available. But I think number one is removing that stigma, but number two is making it very easy for people to access for free and without being labeled. I mean, a lot of politicians and tech executives and so forth have said they're having real problems coping. It's also a positive step, I think, coming out of this pandemic is that a lot of bosses who were also in lockdown, a lot of people from big tech, to their employees said, look, I'm having problems coping because I understand or I feel that I'm going to have to furlough a lot of you, but let's talk about it more in a more kind of sensitive way. So that's a good thing, I think.
I agree. Actually, we have great comments on our YouTube channel from Yulia. It was nice to hear from Abigail and her thoughts on social media.
Great.
And a comment from Marina Bryan on Facebook. It's regarding the previous points that you mentioned. Okay, agreed. AI will not solve all of our problems. There has to be that human element to monitor where artificial intelligence goes off the rails. Exactly. I think we all agree on that.
Yeah, and if I can jump in quickly on that, at the end of every podcast that I do, I now co-host my podcast with Melissa Ritchie, is that we at the end of every podcast, I think from the beginning of the show, when it started, is we remind people, we have this technology in our hands, and it's so easy for us to reach out to somebody and touch them, check up on them, whether a text message, an email, a quick phone call over WhatsApp, to see how they're doing. Because there are so many people out there, millions and millions of people suffering in silence. And, Melissa and I just interviewed Dr. Nahid Badalia from Boston. We talked about the pandemic and where we are right now. And she clearly said, we're not near the end. We're probably not even close because of the variants that are coming in. So don't give up these habits, not only of protecting yourself, vaccination, masks, distancing, don't go to work if you're sick, but also the kind things we've learned to do during the pandemic is to reach out and touch somebody. One more, quick thought on that, and I think it's in the book as well, is the other thing I do wonder about is what is our human interactions going to be like once we reach herd immunity, perhaps? Because I know, for example, where I live in Sydney, British Columbia, it's mostly an older population there. And even today, when we're in pretty good shape vaccination-wise, people still do a big circle around you when you put them on the sidewalk. You're going to see a lot of folks who feel vulnerable continuing to want to limit their human contact. And we can't forget about them as well.
Absolutely. And actually, one more question from Terence. How will the world be better prepared for the next pandemic, which will eventually happen? You just mentioned
Great
that.
Great question. Well, excuse me, is that, I'm hoping that, during the pandemic, a lot of inequalities were exposed. My goodness, if there's one thing we learned in Canada, also to a certain extent the United States, is what I call the mass warehousing of our elderly and what kind of conditions they're living in. I mean, we just had 2 emergencies with our elderly folks in Canada. One was, of course, the pandemic that many of them needlessly died because a lot of them are now in for-profit homes. These are not closely regulated. And it was terrible what happened, inexcusable. I hope government reacts quickly and make sure that this didn't happen again. But then, I'm talking about building back better. Are we seeing that from our governments? Are they learning lessons? And I put that to WHO as well. And I got the kind of feeling from them that they don't feel that elected leaders have learned lessons. And I'll give you a quick example. I mean, it was unbelievable. We had this incredible heat wave about 10 days ago in British Columbia. Normally a heat wave for us, where I live, is 24 or 25 Celsius. It went up close to the 40s in some places, 40 plus. We had, if I'm not mistaken, more than 500 deaths in British Columbia, sudden deaths, mostly among older people, living on their own or in these homes, no air conditioning, no fans, ventilation, nobody checking on them. I mean, come on, have we not learned anything during this pandemic? So we have to not only look at government to build that better, but even ourselves, how we're going to be caring henceforth for our elderly, for the vulnerable people in our communities. I hope we come out of this on the better side. And just quickly, hopefully too, is that there'll be more sharing of technology in terms of, for example, vaccine development. I could sense a disgust from WHO leadership on what's happening with vaccines, what's been happening with vaccines, countries literally hoarding them. And again, I'm not going to defend my own government. I mean, I think by now we have enough orders in Canada to vaccinate everyone 5 times over. On the one hand, it's great, and you have to take risks in vaccine procurement because the knowledge was not that great earlier on. But the thing about vaccines is once they're produced and they're out the gate, out of the factory, and they're already on their way to you, it's very, very difficult to reroute them and send them to poorer countries. And I hope that Canada is taking, and other countries are taking those types of lessons seriously.
Thank you. I have one more question. You know, our audience are mostly young people
Sure.
just starting their careers and or are still university students. What do you think about distance learning, online education? Will
Yeah.
it substitute traditional classrooms eventually?
Yeah, well, it's amazing when you look at the numbers. For example, in Southeast Asia alone, last year, 40 million people went onto the internet for the first time, a lot of them younger people. And that's great because they can take advantage of distance learning. They can get involved in the gig economy. They can order things from home. They don't have to go to the hospital. They can do telehealth. But on the other hand, being so new to online, they're very vulnerable too, from attacks, from people trying to manipulate them, and so on. On the distance learning, there are very few examples of countries that were ready to embrace it. One of them was Singapore. Even before the pandemic started, they had a platform ready to go. It was already in action that students could do distance learning from home. And from a public health perspective, it's probably a very good thing. From a mental health perspective, probably not as good. I know from talking to people like Diana Graeber, I mentioned people like that, is a lot of educators felt they were caught flat-footed, that there is, basically said, okay, start distance learning with your students, not even having the proper equipment or training. I know for a lot of young people, it was very difficult for them being at home. One of the things I talk about in the book, and I was researching this for Digital Crack, was what we call the digital divide, meaning a lot of young people don't have access to technology. They don't have a laptop, or they may have a smartphone, but they don't have Wi-Fi, or they don't have broadband. And a lot of distance learning or working from home requires broadband. We always think of that digital divide as the West and the poor southern countries, or Africa, sub-Saharan African countries, that they don't have access. But actually, no. I know from my research in the United States, you can go to some neighborhoods in Las Vegas, not that far from the Strip, the Las Vegas Strip, and find families, typically 35,000 annual income or under, no broadband, no Wi-Fi. So what do the kids do? They have to go out, do their homework or distance learning, if they even have a Starbucks close by. But I like what some jurisdictions are doing. For example, you have some examples of school boards or communities parking Wi-Fi enabled school buses in these underprivileged communities, and kids could go there, and not only do they have free Wi-Fi, but they're given lunch too. Mm-hmm. So, but people have had a tough time on all levels. I've talked to many parents who imagine working from home, taking care of the kids, trying to facilitate their distance learning. A lot of the burden fell disproportionately on parents as well. It hasn't been an easy time on everyone.
Can't agree more. I mean, with hard skills, I understand it. I think it's possible to learn them online. What about soft skills, communication skills? I think it's in human nature to copy when you interact in person, and that's how you learn soft skills, especially if you're a teenager or a young kid. Do you think technology will evolve to the level, when micro-emotions will be featured online, this energy will be felt, or it's impossible?
Well, one of the chapters in the book is about wearable technology, and I remember being in Singapore years and years and years ago, where no one had even heard of this term. But I was at a high-tech fashion show where the folks on the catwalk there already had technology embedded in their clothing. And for example, it was possible, talked about at that time, that you could trade LinkedIn details, contacts, or business cards touchless because you have a chip or something in you, and then it interacts with them. But I don't think there'll ever be a replacement for in-person human interaction, and that is a big fear of mine in this pandemic, especially young people. One of the things I learned in doing Digital Crack, and one of the things I talked about in my first TED Talk, is very, very young infants and how they kind of get accustomed to the world around them. You'll notice that when you hold a small kid, is basically they're staring at you, they're mapping out your face, your expression. What's going to happen now when, for example, parents are wearing masks a lot more? A lot of that real estate on the face is covered. What's going to happen now that so much time is being spent on the screen? The one piece of research that shocked me is that because kids are looking at screens so much, they're growing up with less empathy. They're growing up with the less ability to read their parents' or an adult's expressions. That's a pretty scary place to be in as humanity, I think. So there's a real balancing act to be played, I think, in terms of how much time on screens. Look, I talked to a name familiar to a lot of listeners here, I'm sure, Dr. Boris Lushniak. He's the former U.S. Surgeon General. And I asked him, like, why don't you future gaze for me and tell us what do you think is going to happen? And he said, you know what, it's not going to be the good old days anymore. And he said, maybe the handshake was not a good public health measure. Maybe we'll find other ways to acknowledge and, show our love and affection to the other human being in front of us. But I think this is something that remains to be seen. But we are going to be spending lots more time online. AI will replace a lot of things that normally are done, including perhaps even teachers and doctors and things like that. But I really, really hope we don't lose that human touch.
Me too.
Yeah.
I really hope we won't lose it. Thank you. In your book, you made a few predictions about the world of future. Could you list those, the ones that you are confident about and the ones that you think maybe or maybe not?
Well, as a journalist, that's the difficult thing about making predictions. You could be wrong, and we're not right 100% of the time.
We're not judging too.
Okay. But one, I just mentioned is the disappearance of touchless technology. Excuse me. China is the greatest example of this. Hardly anyone uses money there. So, they used WeChat and other platforms to pay. But I also put in the warning there that the more these technologies become embraced and embedded, the more they're used as tools of surveillance, especially in China. Give you a quick example. I've been off into Shenzhen in southern China. You jaywalk there, you cross illegally across the street. Before you even make it halfway across the street, the CCTV cameras will detect you, and they've already deducted your account. And not only that, but your name and your photo could be posted on a big digital billboard to shame you. Yeah, and there's also something in China called the social credit score they've introduced. If you have a messy backyard, if you're caught gossiping about your neighbor, if you've jaywalked, stuff like that, that will deduct from your social score. You'll find it difficult to get a job, difficult to travel, stuff like that. Telehealth, massive adoption spurt, especially in China. In China now, you can go online, you can get diagnosed, have a remote consultation with a doctor, hopefully a human doctor. You can get your prescription done digitally. It's sent to the pharmacy. It's delivered. Insurance picks up the cost automatically. And then AI does the whole auditing. It's a closed loop. It's really, really fascinating. An interesting one is supply chains. Remember at the beginning of the pandemic how we have problems with procuring masks?
Yes. Toilet paper.
PPE, toilet paper, ventilators.
Ventilators, yes.
Well, guess what? China was the warehouse to the world and all of that. And this is another criticism of theirs. And I think they played a kind of mask diplomacy at the beginning by not only sending substandard PPE and equipment overseas, but also deciding who's going to get it and who's not. I already talked about the female leaders, and I think how much more of them will be elected. And then, I think, sorry about that, is I think that those emergency powers that I talked about, a lot of them will still be retained. Working from home we talked about, but, I have to tell you, I'm really worried about what's going on in a lot of metropolitan centers. I'm talking about downtown Seattle, Portland. I was in Los Angeles, to a certain extent New York. Seattle, I go there a lot. It's part of my neighborhood. I hardly recognized it when I was there a few months ago because, you had the big protests there. But you also have a lot of people working from home, so no one goes there anymore. Homelessness has skyrocketed in a lot of these places for many, many reasons. In Beverly Hills, now you have along the boulevard there communities of homeless people. One thing I wanted to mention, Oh, yeah. Okay, and then there's social audio, Clubhouse, and the Twitter chat program. I said in the book that it may only be a fad, but I think now more and more, as we get tired of the screen, we're going to spend more time on those social audio apps. One more thing about, again, this is evolving kind of set of predictions, but the working from home is what's happening too is a lot of people are moving away, like I said, from the city centers, going to the suburbs, buying a dacha, tens of kilometers away. And in a lot of places, including in Canada, the Ukrainian communities thrive on a physical presence. People going to church and then staying afterwards. Maybe there's a bake sale, Ukrainian dancing, plus scouting organization. All of these things depend on people getting together. I'm hearing it still anecdotally that there's a growing worry in the Ukrainian community. And don't forget, too, we have a lot of Ukrainian festivals, of where things are going to go once the lockdowns are more relaxed, whether that core mass group of people are going to be present in those same localities to be able to do fundraising, to donate, to do all that stuff. It's evolving thing, but it's something I'm keeping an eye on.
Oh, brave new world.
A brave new world, a slightly concerning new world, but a brave one, yeah.
I would love to remind our audience that you can still leave your comments and questions on Facebook of America House Kyiv or on our YouTube channel. And we do have one more question from our viewer. This is Lubomir Markevich. Hi, Michael. Do you think that societies where either individualism or collectivism prevails as a core value will help determine whether they are more successful in dealing with future pandemics or other crises?
My goodness, I knew I would get a tough question from
difficult one, yes.
a learned person, but I think that, I don't want to say that technology enables individualism, but it certainly, if you do want to be alone and do things from outside the crowd, technology certainly allows you to do that and be connected when you want to, interact with society when you want to. And I mentioned this trend of people moving away from city cores and into more distant type of places. And I'm wondering, it would be interesting to do an anthropological study and see how those folks are going to cope being away from masses of people. But I think technology, as Abigail said, that allows us to collectively decide things, make decisions on where we travel, on what kind of work we might take, that sort of thing. And what technology really showed us, too, is that even though we were under strict lockdowns, is that we're still able to communicate with people halfway across the world. We were able to share experiences. We were able to share advice, too, on where things will go. And, I think, I always look at how our Ukrainian Hromada, our Ukrainian community in Canada and elsewhere can help Ukraine at a time of need. And I'm hoping that technology will help because I think our vaccination uptake actually, I don't think it is. It's very high, getting very high in North America, is that maybe the community using technology can play a role to help convince folks here that it's a really good idea. I'm saying this is because I recently looked at the numbers for Ukraine in terms of vaccination uptake. It's in the single digits. It's among the lowest in the world. And we found in Canada that if we come to vaccination too late, we can't vaccinate ourselves out of the pandemic, especially when the variants have come. And they've come to Canada, they're going to come here. So I think, I don't mean to depress people, but I've talked to enough experts to be able to say this with some sort of authority, is that I think it could be a catastrophe here come the fall when people spend more time indoors. I've been here long enough to observe that people are not observing social distancing. A lot of them are not wearing masks. If they're wearing masks, they're not wearing them properly. So it's kind of the perfect storm for another huge spike. And it's the last thing the Ukrainian economy needs. It's the last thing Ukrainian society needs. So, hopefully we can show the collective strength of Ukrainians globally is by helping each other through technology to avoid that sort of catastrophe.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And this leads me to another question I wanted to ask you about COVID, and the global pandemic is usually mentioned as the accelerator, of global changes, of new trends. Where you see it as an innovator?
COVID as an innovator. Oh, well, definitely in terms of vaccine development. I mean, the new vaccine technology happened at record speed. I know a lot of people have problems with that because it wasn't tested as widely perhaps as a normal vaccine. But the collaboration tools are amazing and what we're able to do. Also, the kind of lessons learned. I talked to so many medical experts on my podcast and elsewhere, and the way they now communicate with colleagues halfway across the world. I think that as an accelerator, we've been put forward at least 10 years in terms of stuff like the work from home technology, the telehealth. These were things that were already existing, but there was a massive adoption spurt. So I really think that the economic harm that could have come out of COVID was a lot less than it could have been without technology. That, again, it allowed us in many respects to not skip a beat. But having said that, I think it's important to point out that the person sitting in their home in Silicon Valley and the person sitting in Lesotho in a remote village did not by any means experience COVID-19 in the same way. I talked about that digital divide already, but the lack of, for example, of poor countries, developing countries to technology, but also to vaccines is very, very worrisome. If there's one thing we've learned, again, from this pandemic is how quickly viruses can spread, whether they're computer viruses, whether they're human viruses, but also how a small problem on the other side of the earth can become a big, big problem for many larger, stronger, more resilient economies on the other side of the earth. So I'll just end that answer quickly. As I quoted Janine DiGiovanni, she's a conflict reporter, Yale senior fellow, and one of the things she wrote is that we have to really, really be careful going forth because, again, a small conflict can happen again on one side of the world and it could really surprise us, and overnight it becomes a global conflagration.
Exactly. I was thinking the same way, how it became a global problem. It's not just one country issue. We're all
almost overnight, and that's why communication is so important. That's why, the other thing I thought about a lot during the pandemic is the kind of moral authority of the WHO, because as I kind of insinuated earlier, the WHO is basically a collection of member states. And it doesn't really have the ability to dictate to countries what to do. The only thing it has is moral authority. And, you may remember at the beginning of the pandemic, the WHO leadership said, don't start imposing travel or trade restrictions because they don't work. But what did most countries do, including Canada? We closed the Canadian border really quickly, is we put in those restrictions. And while it may have retarded the movement of the virus, it cut off a lot of other things. I mean, I'm gearing up to write an op-ed right now criticizing my government for not moving quick enough to open that US-Canada border. Probably a lot of Americans watching this. I salute them for getting vaccinated so quickly. You guys are far ahead of Canada right now. But being where I come from a border town, we really feel the pain of that border closure, family ties, the tourism, the commerce. It's time to start talking about opening up that border. And I think this week there's going to be more pressure from Congress on that.
So true. It's the paradox we're all living in. We're so united and now we're so isolated too,
Right.
simultaneously. What will happen with traveling? What do you think?
Favorite topic of mine. Well, look, it's good to see travel being resumed, but I am critical of a lot of airline bosses, hospitality firm bosses, cruise ship operators for really putting the screws to government leaders for opening up too soon. Of course, they're concerned about their bottom line. They're concerned about their employees, but I don't think you should go ahead and, for example, start filling the middle seat of the airplane without enough science available to say that the virus won't spread, between us so quickly. Another thing that's happening is the creation of vaccine passports, so-called vaccine passports, something WHO does not support as far as I know, but this is coming fast and swift. And it is important to be able to show in a verified way that you've been vaccinated, but there are a lot of people who, as I said, don't have access to technology. I think that also that we're already seeing this, is travel is going to become the preserve of those who can afford it. Not only do you have to have the vaccines, I mean, you have to get the COVID test. The PCR test here is in the neighborhood, I think, the best deal you can get is 900 hryvnia. You do 2 of those on one return trip, and that can double the cost of your ticket. And the WHO concern is really that these kind of vaccine passports or documents are going to put an even bigger divide between the have and the have-nots. I got to tell you, Tatiana, we've had the most bizarre policy in Canada is that if, for example, I want to, under the recently relaxed rules, if I wanted to go to the United States, our good friend and neighbor from Canada, we can only get there by flying. We can come back by road, but this also opened up that cross-border travel to the more privileged people. And then again, you have to do the tests, you have to be able to afford quarantining at home for 14 days. How are you going to go to work? So this is something I hope would have been discussed more robustly at the G7 and G20 fora. But the other big thing is business travel ain't going to come back anywhere where it was before. A lot of companies are getting used to Zoom. There's a lot more awareness now of the planet, the environment, that if we fly too much, we're damaging the economy. I think people, not even for business travel, even for leisure travel, are going to think a lot more about how often they travel. They're going to stay for longer. They probably will choose more isolated accommodations. Stuff like that. There'll be big changes. The cruise ship industry will be the last to come back. A lot of concern about the spread of the virus in those types of closed environments.
I think our visitors are probably all missing traveling
big time.
across the globe. So yeah.
And sorry, one more quick thing. Another concern of mine too was that during the pandemic, journalists had to do a lot of their reporting, international reporting from home. It's been an existential event, the pandemic, for journalism, for media. Will the media bosses, to the same extent, allow, for example, an investigative reporter to fly halfway across the earth to do a story there? I don't know about that anymore. It's another big concern too.
Photographers, those who traveled to have those very, special shots, now they can't. And I think a lot of creative artists are also very much hit by the pandemic.
Absolutely.
I mean, dancers, their career life is very short, and now they can't perform in theaters, let's say.
Freelancers, I mean, I was in touch with the op-ed editor of the Miami Herald, which has been going through tough times, but it's still a major metropolitan daily. She told me they're not paying freelance contributors anymore for opinion pieces. A lot of staffs at newspapers, editorial operations worldwide have been cut down to skeleton kind of levels. But on the other hand, I'm also kind of hopeful that freelancers, reporters, for example, here in Ukraine, may be asked to step up and do more reporting rather than sending a foreign correspondent here. So maybe we may see some positive out of that too.
Which leads me to another question. Again, our audience are young people, probably starting their careers. Do you think there will be new careers, new professions in the world?
Absolutely. There will be careers that disappear. For example, middlemen are one of the most affected. Normally, for example, in producing this book, I would have gone through a publisher and a book agent. I didn't have time for that, and I think the readers wanted this to come out pretty quickly. So I self-published, and I went through Mr. Bezos, on Amazon. But also my book has also the audio version of the book has been taken up by a major U.S. publisher. I'll have news about that soon, so that's good. But
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. But this would be a point in time where I think it's good to share a term that I came across in researching the book. It's called the she session. There were millions of women, not only in the United States, but worldwide, who either lost their careers or had to give up their careers, for example, to help their kids do distance learning. The numbers are absolutely staggering. But what happened when we had that big economic uptake a few years ago is that a lot of women were employed in the hospitality industry, travel industry, and these are all customer-facing, front-facing positions. Well, guess what were the first positions to be eliminated when COVID struck? Exactly those same positions. Massive, massive numbers fired. And it's coming back very, very, flight attendants, for example, dominated by women. So that's coming back very slowly. But, if you were part of the gig economy, things like that, you had the wind at your back with this pandemic, because those are exactly the type of careers that really benefited from the pandemic. At the beginning of the book, I quote Dr. Picard. This is the chap the scientist, the modern day explorer who traveled around the Earth in a solar airplane in a hot air balloon. And he said, for example, if you're the taxi driver at the airport and all of a sudden because of COVID your job is eliminated, well, don't just sit at home and worry. Learn a new language, learn new skills, because when the lockdown is lifted, you can come back, for example, as a tour guide. You can make a lot more money, have a lot more interesting career. So I deliberately put that pretty close to the front of the book, so to give people a kind of pause for thought and inspiration.
Wonderful. I will read this for sure.
Thank you.
Tell us about your book. What's happening now? You already mentioned there is a good news.
Sure. Well, thanks for that question. So it's available in print. The hard copy edition is available through Amazon. But if you go to the website digitalpandemicbook.com, you can purchase the book there. And actually, I have a special, if I can offer a surprise for America, for everyone watching, is that if you put in the code AHKIV, Kyiv spelled K-Y-I-V, capital letters, one word, on the part of the website where you buy directly from the writer, you'll get a nice discount. The digital version is already there. It's being downloaded by a lot of people worldwide. And then, as soon as I go home, I'm going to self-isolate and voice myself the audio version of the book. And that is going to be turned into the audio version of the book. And I'll post news on that soon, but I've got a major American publisher taking up the rights to that. So it'll be very, very widely available. And then one last thing. Since I came here, I was at the Hubei Arsenal, and a lot of Ukrainians said, you have to have a Ukrainian version of the book. So
I agree.
we've approached a couple of major publishers here to get it translated very quickly and printed in Ukrainian version. So watch out for that. And then, I'm doing the media tours. Bookstores are starting to stock it. I'll have on the website where to get it from bookstores, because even though I self-published, I'm a big fan of bookstores, and I really want to help them as well.
That's incredible. Once the Ukrainian translation is up, please return to America House.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back.
We'll have probably maybe offline presentation of your book. What are you working right now on? What is your new project? I mean, audiobook?
Sure. The audiobook, that should probably take a couple of weeks. And, it can be very, very expensive to do an audiobook. I've done my research, but if you do it yourself, and a lot of people said, well, you're doing the podcast anyway, so why don't you voice it? So I want it to be authentic. And I'm also returning to opinion writing for CNN Opinion and others, because right now, I'm keeping an eye on the end of July when President Zelensky finally gets that White House visit. And as you know, I believe he was in Berlin this weekend. Angela Merkel is headed to Washington to talk to President Biden, and then it'll be Zelensky's turn. That's something I'm going to be keeping a keen eye on, commenting op-ed-wise and also on international media. There's a lot at stake for Ukraine right now. As I said on CBS News before coming here, is to Western leaders, Ukraine should be the most strategically important country in the world right now for many, many reasons. And the big one is, of course, how can we possibly, as a civilized society, as a democracy, as a group of democracies, allow one of the biggest land grabs in modern times, Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, being taken by Russia, millions displaced, thousands killed in this day and age. Red lines have to be drawn, and red lines have to be respected.
Thank you so much. What a great project on your way, and congratulations again on your book being published and news on your audiobook. Our time is almost over. I would love to thank you so much, Michael, for coming and presenting your book and your opinion about digital pandemic, about COVID-19 and the world that is is still to happen for all of us. Dear visitors, I'm also so thankful for your questions and for being with us tonight. I just remind that all the opinions voiced were solely by the author of the book, not by America House necessarily. Thank you for watching. We'll be in touch with you with our other programs, and have a great night, everyone.